Hello, my name is Ronnie Al-Jundi, and you are watching the Arabic Hour. On today's program, we bring you an interview with Michael Provence on the conflict in Syria and the political origins and context of the uprising. This segment is brought to you by Alternate Focus.
The devastation is shocking, but it's nothing like what a modern military could do if it really wanted to destroy cities. I mean, this is a sort of a thing that people who are appalled and outraged by the violence of the Syrian government don't acknowledge. That the government is actually not unleashing everything against these cities. If they did, the cities would be totally destroyed and all the population would be killed.
Michael Provence is a scholar at UC San Diego. He has published numerous essays in foreign policy publications. His field of research is the impact of colonialism on modern Middle Eastern history. His current project is a history of the Middle East during the period of colonial rule between 1920 and 1950. And now, understanding Syria.
We're here with Dr. Michael Provence, Associate Professor of History at the University of California in San Diego. We'll be talking about Syria particularly and the region in general. Michael, tell me a little bit about the background of Syria. You know, after the father died and the son came in, who's now the current leader, to give me a sense of where this revolt, where the wellsprings of the revolt occurred.
Yeah. Well, when Hafez al-Assad died in 1999, his son, Bashar al-Assad, who wasn't really the chosen son, but the second son, who had been an ophthalmologist in training in London, had been sort of getting groomed for a few years. But people didn't really take him seriously until suddenly the father died in the summer of '99. And he was sort of immediately thrust into the presidency. There was a constitutional amendment. The vice president stepped aside, and suddenly he was president. And it was a kind of I mean, I was living in Syria at the time, and the death of the father was a big surprise. The emergence of the son was not a surprise, and there was a kind of a perception among people that the future was really worrisome. And once the succession took place, people kind of relaxed. And, you know, there was some continuity. I mean, Syrians, I think, like people in the region generally, saw the Lebanese Civil War. They had seen other kinds of regional conflagrations, and were really worried about instability and chaos at the top. So he had a kind of an easy time, Bashar al-Assad, as he became the president at 34. And the impression I had was that he immediately began to use this relief on the part of the population to kind of ease things up, to release prisoners. He closed a prison. There was a period that was called the Damascus Spring that took place. This was 2000. This was the fall and spring, fall of 2000, the spring of 2001. And dissidents began to, there was a free newspaper, that is to say a non-governmental newspaper, and people embraced this. And the impression was, among many people, and myself included, was that he was using his popularity with the public as a weapon against elements of his father's government. People who were still lurking around in the shadows, people who were in charge of the security agencies, people who had been high-ranking military officers who were back there getting ready or preparing to pull strings. And he used his popularity as a weapon against those people. But within a year, once he was firmly ensconced, the repression began again, and people began to be rounded up. The discussion forums were closed down. Some of the liberalizing reforms were changed, but the reforms that were not changed had to do with capitalism, with freeing capital, with privatizing certain things, and stuff along those lines. And so there emerged over the coming years a kind of a new class of, we could say, crony capitalists of his generation, who emerged, and and kind of gutted the ideological component of the previous nationalist, socialist government that his father had stood for.
You talk about capitalism. During this period of the Sun and liberalizing capitalism, was the country open to foreign investment? Could you talk about that a little?
It had not been. And I mean, the Syrian economy was a closed economy over the 30 years of Hafez al-Assad's rule. His son opened it, but opened it to people who were connected. And so, for example, there was a hotel built in downtown Damascus, the Four Seasons, which was built with money that came from the Gulf. It was built with money from Walid bin Talal, the financier. And it was built on the grounds of what had been a public park and a Mamluk tomb complex. So these public properties were destroyed to make a kind of a new monument to what we can call crony capitalism. And this was, I think, emblematic of the kind of reforms that took place. People who were close to the top became wealthy, and an entire new strata of kind of conspicuous consumption emerged on the part of people who were close to the government. The most notorious example, of course, is the cousin of the president himself, Rami Makhlouf, who received the cell phone concession and became the richest person in the country, and essentially controlled or does control virtually the entire economy.
So are you saying that there's no Western money, no European money, no American investment, no Citibank in Syria?
Well, there isn't much. I mean, the money that has flowed into the country has been from Gulf investors. It's not like, say, for example, the Gulf states like Kuwait or Qatar that are fully integrated into the world economy, that have giant state stock portfolios, things like that. I mean, Syria is a poor country, and during the 30 years of Hafez al-Assad's rule, the economic engine of the country was agriculture, and it remains agriculture. And because of the nationalist, socialist, Ba'athist ideology of the government, and because of the rural origins of the ruling stratas, Hafez al-Assad and the people around him, the countryside did pretty well. And the countryside was electrified. There were good schools, there were hospitals, stuff like that. And that was part of the ideology of rule. And conspicuous consumption. I mean, there was a lot of corruption, but it wasn't the kind of corruption that we see today. Today, the corruption is huge transfers of wealth from the public treasury, or control of capital from the public treasury to these selected individuals and people close to them. In those days, it was different. It was corruption of the military structures, but the people would say that the living standard of Syrians in the 90s, in the 80s, was uniform and uniformly low. Today, you see Maseratis on the streets of Damascus, or in the past 10 years, and this is actually sort of a shock. It's a shock, and it's a grievance to people within the country who are not prospering. And in those rural regions and places, in fact, precisely the places that have been most involved in the uprising over the last year, those are the places that have suffered and declined in economic prosperity over the past decade, as this kind of transfer has gone from supporting the countryside, supporting the pillars of legitimacy of the state, to enriching a select number of people who are hooked up and close to the government.
Let's talk a little bit more about the uprising and the aggrieved. Is it more workers and peasants who are impoverished? Is it more the intellectual class? Or is it across class lines, this uprising that we're seeing now?
Well, would-be workers. I think I'll tell you I'll give you an example. I have a friend who lives in Dara, which is where the uprising began, and we haven't been able to contact him for well since the beginning. And I was talking with another friend who knows this guy well, and he's a prosperous farmer, a reasonably prosperous farmer in this region. So he owns some land, and you know, he has a pretty nice house, and he has a car, a truck actually, a farming truck. So this is, by Syrian standards, this is a pretty prosperous farmer. Now, we were talking about him, my friend and I, and he said, well, we don't have to worry about him because he's too old to protest, and his children are too young. So in this way, we have precisely identified the strata of the people who are most likely to be out in the streets, who are high school students, college-age students, people who are frustrated, unemployed, who have aspirations to some kind of material prosperity and yet cannot leave their parents' homes because they can't earn enough money or even find jobs to go and make it on their own. And the population has increased rapidly. Population growth is very high. And so these people are educated, literate, cosmopolitan, watching satellite news stations, and have quite a lot of knowledge about the outside world, and yet really have their aspirations stunted by what they think are the limited possibilities delivered by the government. I think this is the operative group. Now there is a kind of a traditional oppositional intellectual group or class within Damascus, within Aleppo, people who have been opposed to the government. Many of them have served time in jail. Some of these people are in their 80s, even older. So those people are still around too. But the people who are really out in the streets every day, day after day, are people in their teens and 20s and maybe early 30s.
In the very early stages, were these people organized enough to bring specific grievances to the government, and if so, what was the government's response before we get to the stage we're seeing now on television?
Yeah. Yes, they were. I mean, the grievances were the same grievances that we've seen elsewhere in the period of from late 2010 through 2011 in Egypt and Libya, and in Bahrain, in Yemen, and other places. The demands were articulated in the first instance, I think, by people who were veteran activists, who had spent time in prison, who were sophisticated and pointed in their criticisms, but they were adopted by people who were protesting in the streets, who in some cases had never even known that those dissidents, those oppositional intellectuals even existed, but they coalesced at this moment in early 2011, in February and March. The demands were an end to the emergency law, which is effective martial law in Syria.
How long has the emergency law been?
It's been in effect since 1963. And emergency law in Syria and emergency law elsewhere is actually colonial martial law. So it's a kind of a, I mean, there was a period between 1948 or 1946 when Syria was independent from France to 1963, where emergency law was not constantly in action. But emergency law is simply a evolution, a legal development of martial law imposed by the colonial regime. It's the same in Israel and Palestine. Many of the laws that enable people, house demolitions, for example, are actually British mandate colonial law codes that still exist. And so in Syria, it's very much the same. So this emergency law essentially denies all of the constitutional guarantees that that citizens, ordinary citizens, should enjoy. And so the demand was rights of citizenship in our own country, an end to the emergency law, democratic transition, a multi-party elections, and the rule of law, simply stated. Very simple. And based on, I mean, it's a very pointed critique because these are things the government claims to be doing anyway. So the structures of these legal structures exist. but they're not respected by the government in the same way that they were not respected by the colonial governments that preceded these post-colonial governments.
And when these demands were presented to the government, what was their response?
We can talk. We're studying it, but this has gone on for 11 years actually. We need more time. It takes time. We don't want to develop or to change is important. We must change. We know we have to change, but we have to do it at our own pace. It can't be driven by outside demands. And then finally, in March, late March, there was a speech given by the president, which really was the crucial turning point, where President Assad, Bashar al-Assad, denounced people who had been protesting as traitors, basically, and people who had to be crushed by the power of the state, and that the movement was a foreign conspiracy, by which, of course, he means foreign conspiracy motivated or under the impetus of the United States and Israel. And this was a kind of an insult to people who had been protesting, and this really sort of severed, I think, the last, or undermined the legitimacy of the president and the state. And this was a year ago now, the end of March 2011.
Internationally, who are Syria's friends, and how does that play out in what's going on?
Russia and Iran. But I mean, this is a shifting cast of characters. Russia and Iran, however, are the two constants in Syrian geopolitics. Since, in the case of Russia, since the 60s, the mid-60s, and in the case of Iran, since the Iranian Revolution or even before. Syria had contacts with the people who became the revolutionaries in Iran even before the revolution. And Syria was an opponent of the government in Iraq, which was actually, of course, after the revolution, a kind of an ally of the United States. So there was a geopolitical kind of a chessboard. The Syrians were with the Soviets. They were with the Iranian revolutionaries, and they were against the United States, Israel, and the conservative monarchies of the Gulf. And to some extent, this hasn't changed too much. The Syrians are still very close to Iran. People who claim that this has something to do with religion don't know what they're talking about. It has nothing to do with the religious component of the various governing structures. It's about geopolitics and national interests and a relationship, a 30-year-old relationship based on mutual interest and mutual trust, probably, at the highest echelons of the Syrian and Iranian government.
What we see on television is brutal. Here we are in the spring, and the images on television from, is it Ham? Is that the Hama? Yeah, it's a repeat of what the father had done, only with more modern weapons, I suppose. And there's talk of NATO, there's talk of intervention, and so on. And some people say we should do it to save lives. Other people say if we do it, it's the West going into another country in the Middle East, and so on. Talk to us about that, if you can.
Well, in 1982, and in the preceding several years, from the mid-late 70s, there was an insurgency in Syria, led by the Muslim Brotherhood, against the government of Hafez al-Assad. Hafez al-Assad's government had been popular, relatively, but the Muslim Brotherhood opposed it on religious grounds, on political grounds, and began a kind of a campaign of assassination and not exactly armed uprising, but sort of various outrages against the government and leading figures within the government. In 1982, the Muslim Brotherhood barricaded itself within Hama, this fourth largest Syrian city behind Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. Hama is and declared it a free city. The Syrian government launched an assault on the city, sealed it, which is sort of the standard practice for them. They seal the city, they cut off electricity, they cut off phone service, they cut off water, sealed the city, and then besieged it and destroyed the central area of the city and killed some tens of thousands of citizens, including probably some who were armed insurgents of the Muslim Brotherhood. Declared the membership in the Muslim Brotherhood a crime punishable by death, and like I say, destroyed the city with artillery, airstrikes, and then ground troops in the city. The troops were led by the president's brother, a man named Rafat al-Assad, who later was expelled from the family in a way and is in exile in London now. Not because of what he did then, although it was related. He was in a way punished as a kind of a scapegoat for the repression, but also because he challenged his brother's rule within the country. So in 1984 he went into exile. The echoes with today are intense. Rafat al-Assad was in charge of the special forces of the Syrian army, this sort of elite group that carried out this. It was not the regular army. And today, Maher al-Assad, the younger brother of the current president, Bashar al-Assad, is in charge of these same sorts of special forces that are in charge of the most brutal kinds of repression within the country today, these elite forces. But there were differences too. I mean, then the Muslim Brotherhood uprising was limited to these one cities, and the tactics were kind of terror tactics, and it was not broadly popular. Today, there was a peaceful movement of demonstrations that was kind of challenged immediately with appalling state violence. So it's a different kind of a movement, a peaceful movement, a movement of broad-based opposition. And finally, the government, as far as we know, has not used really heavy weaponry against these cities, except for artillery. No airstrikes, maybe helicopter gunships, but not very much. The devastation is shocking, but it's nothing like what a modern military could do if it really wanted to destroy cities. I mean, this is a sort of a thing that people who are appalled and outraged by the violence of the Syrian government don't acknowledge. That the government is actually not unleashing everything against these cities. If they did, the cities would be totally destroyed and all the population would be killed. And that is not the case. But in Hama, in 1982, in the space of 2 days, the government killed more people than have been killed in the entire year since this uprising. Now, so the tactics are different, the outcomes are a bit different, and the contours of the confrontation are different, because this uprising is much more popular and much broader and much more threatening in a way to the legitimacy of the government than the Muslim Brotherhood uprising of 1982.
You say it's broader. Let's talk about that a minute. I mean, is there a way to assess how broad it really is? In other words, within Syrian society, there are those who will back the president and those who will back the resistance. Yeah. How does that fall in your scholarship in terms of numbers and so on? How popular is this popular uprising?
Well, I think it's very hard to say. I mean, nobody can really say. And I think that people who would claim to be able to quantify these kinds of percentages are not, it's not credible. Now, there is a sectarian component which has been exploited very effectively by the state, by the government, which is to say that the uprising is based on Islamist criminals and foreign conspiracies from the Gulf by Islamic extremists. The government is composed in its top echelon of people who are members of a sectarian minority, a kind of a quasi-Islamic sectarian minority in Syria. And there's a large Christian population which has been usually supportive of the government. The government has made the case repeatedly, and since the very beginning, that the uprising was not people with legitimate grievances for citizenship, but rather armed criminal Islamist terrorists, and that that only the government stands to keep chaos, disorder, and massacres at bay, and with 30 or 40% of the population, this is a compelling argument. So the government has succeeded, I think, in terrifying people so seriously that they support the government because they believe that the opposition is worse. But the opposition or the protest movement did not start out as a sectarian movement, and I'm not sure I don't think it's a sectarian movement today. There are Islamists within it, that's for sure. But there's also members of every sectarian minority also represented among opposition politicians and even people out on the streets. So we can say that there are, thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people have demonstrated, probably millions of people have demonstrated in opposition to the government over the last year, repeatedly, at risk of mortal peril. And probably hundreds of thousands of people have demonstrated in favor of the government with no risk, actually, to them of any kind. And in some cases, they were compelled for reasons of their vocation or whatever. I mean, it's well known that, for example, the schools get a holiday and all the kids are expected to go out on the streets and proclaim their love for the president. Everybody knows this. It's a kind of a performative duty that Syrians are accustomed to. Does this mean that they support the government? No. But, to not go risks something. So there's a wide spectrum here. The percentage of people who actually support the government under any circumstances and believe everything is probably very small. But then there's also people who have benefited materially in significant ways. I mean, who have become literally millionaires in the last 10 years. And of course, for these people, the government is extremely. They may not have accounts in Swiss bank. They may not have Swiss bank accounts, and yet they're very wealthy within Syria. They're deeply committed. People like this. We're talking about the high-ranking military officers, people who are these crony capitalists and so on. These people are deeply committed to the government. They must be. They have to be. They are not all Alawi, not by any means. There are many Christians, Sunnis. They're representative of all religious groupings within the country.
Professor Provence, thanks so much for your comments. We look forward to speaking with you again for part 2.
Thank you.
You have been watching Understanding Syria, an alternate-focused production outlining a political and historical analysis of the Syrian conflict. Stay tuned for part 2 after the break.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
We appreciate you returning for part 2 of your discussion on Syria and the wider area. Just on the news the other day, shots were fired from Syria into Turkey. I think a Turkish citizen was killed. There's a serious refugee problem on the border. And there's talk now in the media of intervention. So there's NATO. Turkey's a member of NATO. There's the United Nations. There's covert intervention, if any intervention. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you know or you surmise about the possibilities of intervention and how this internal Syrian conflict may spread vis-a-vis Turkey and so on?
Yeah. I don't think there's any possibility of intervention. I don't think there will be any intervention. And some of the people who have talked about intervention are I mean, it's fanciful and ridiculous. So the Qataris, the government of Qatar, and the Saudis, who are, especially the Saudis, are long-standing enemies for their own reasons, sectarian enemies, in fact, of Syria, of secular Arab nationalism, which the Syrian state once represented and doesn't represent any longer. So the Saudis and some of the Gulf monarchies have their own reasons, long-standing historical reasons, for animosity with Syria. Some of these countries have talked about arming the rebels. This is nonsense. There is no way that Qatar or the Saudis can arm anyone in Syria. In order to do this, they would have to either take the arms into the Damascus airport, which is under the control of the central government, obviously, or they would have to move them through a neighboring country. They will not be able to do this. None of the neighboring countries would permit this, including Turkey. None of the countries in the region, including Israel, or the United States for that matter, are interested in, all of them would like this just to stop. They may not like the Syrian government, but from a geopolitical standpoint, they are more worried about chaos and conflict that will spread beyond Syria than anything else. And so the prospect of arming rebels or prolonging the conflict or intervening in any significant way is not in the cards, no matter what anybody says. It's just not a real possibility. It may be a stick or a kind of a lever to use against the Syrian government, against the Russians perhaps, but it's not a serious prospect.
You know, you said something interesting a minute ago about Israel's view. Israel says of itself that it's the only democracy in the Middle East, but you characterize that they're afraid of widespread chaos. But I thought the overthrow of a dictatorship, as you're describing it, might be in the interests of democracies. Talk a little bit more what you mean by regional chaos.
Well,
who benefits and who doesn't benefit by regional chaos? If you're overthrowing Assad, what's the fear?
Well, the Israelis have discovered that they love Assad, actually. That they love Bashar al-Assad. And
why is that?
Well, because he represents a stable geopolitical system that the Israelis dominate militarily, diplomatically, economically. So it's a belated proclamation of love, but it's a proclamation of love just the same.
So are you saying the Israelis would be on Assad's side rather than on the side of the insurgents?
It's absolutely clear. I mean, there's no question about it. And it's been stated clearly over and over again. Last year, in May, I think it was May anyway, the late New York Times correspondent Anthony Shadid was granted a visa to go and visit Damascus. All the foreign journalists, which is to say Arab journalists, Iranian journalists, Western journalists, everybody had been kicked out of the country. Shadid was given a visa to enter Damascus for 5 hours. He went and he interviewed Rami Makhlouf, the president's cousin, the richest man in Syria. And Makhlouf said, only we can protect the Israelis. He said this in an interview. Now, the following day, the Syrian ambassador to the United States, Imad Mustafa, had to issue a kind of a defense in the pages of the New York Times where he wrote, under his ambassadorial letterhead, Rami Makhlouf does not speak for the Syrian government. He is a private citizen. This is a joke. Everyone knows that he's not a private citizen. He's the most powerful country in the person in the country next to the president. Maybe more powerful than the president. Nobody knows for sure. And so for him to say, we can destabilize the entire region, we stand between chaos and order, and only we can protect the Israeli government, is a kind of an inversion of the traditional rhetoric of legitimacy of the Syrian state that is breathtaking to behold. It's not lost on the Israelis. It's not lost on the Syrians. It's not lost on the Pentagon or the State Department that a weakened Assad is dangerous, but a swept away Assad is very dangerous. And this is I mean, there are people who are continually engaged in fantasies about the Middle East. We used to call people in the government who held these kinds of dreams neocons, who dream of a giant reordering of everything. But this is a rather marginal tendency these days. And so there are people who would say, well, if Syria goes, then we can do what we want in Syria, and Hezbollah will be cut off in Lebanon, and then we can do what we want there. And then the Iranians will not be able to mess around, and we can do what we want over there, so we can have a war with Syria and a war with Iran and take over Lebanon, and wouldn't it be grand? But fortunately, this is no longer a kind of a standpoint which I think is very widely held, because the self-delusional aspect of it is, I think, more apparent than it was, say, in 2003, when many people in positions of tremendous power in the Bush administration, in Israel and elsewhere, actually did talk about this kind of nonsense and delusional fantasy publicly. So I think that that's finished. But this is, I mean, we need to be frank here about what the crimes of the Syrian government are significant and terrible, and the prospects of intervention are minimal. And if intervention takes place, it will not be for the reasons that the Syrian opposition would like. It'll be because it's in the interest of some state, some neighboring state, to do it.
Like who?
Well, isn't any at the moment, and that's why it won't happen. Because doesn't appear to be in anybody's interest to get involved in conflict in Syria. Arguably, it's not even in the interest of the opposition in Syria itself, because, as I said a few minutes ago, the Syrian government is not. I mean, I wouldn't want to use the word restrained, because I think it's an obscenity to say restrained. Restrained is wrong, but they could be much more murderous than they have been. Not on an atrocity level, but on a level of sheer numbers. And if there was an intervention, if there was a significant military threat posed by the Free Syrian Army within Syria, and there is not today, they are not formidable. They are not in a position to challenge the government or the army on any military basis. But if that changed, the forces of repression would be fully unleashed, and the Syrian army would not be going in with machine guns and light artillery. They would be going in with airstrikes.
You're painting a pretty dark picture. So I guess my question is, so where is this going to go if there's no intervention and the opposition doesn't have the strength to really do what it likes to do? What's the end game?
Well, no one knows, of course. But the idea that we have to do something is not necessarily that something has to be done immediately, that we have to act, that other people have to act, I think is as horrible and is heartbreaking and is just miserably sad as that is. I think that there is no useful role that any outside power can really play, apart from what is being done now and what has been done in terms of giving people the ability to leave, to flee the country, to be fed in Turkey or in Jordan, to seize the assets of the Syrian government, to put the entire ruling structure under sanction, which has been done, to strangle the economy of Syria, which is in the control of these cadres at the top, to progressively delegitimize internally and externally the Syrian leadership, and to attempt to the extent possible, to make it more difficult for the government to repress with military means the population. So the UN has a mission, and there was an Arab League mission with observers, and it was unsuccessful. This was some months ago. But at that time, fewer people were getting killed for that period of a few weeks. So these kinds of things are not dramatic, and they're not satisfying, and they don't make people feel better, because so many people, for good reason, are heartbroken and want to do something. But the truth is that most of us are helpless, and doing something may not be, doing the wrong thing could be more damaging to the long-term prospects of the Syrian population than doing nothing. The government is many people, I believe this, and I hope that this is true, the government is mortally weakened. Now, in other similar sorts of circumstances, like Iran, for example, we had a scholar of Iran named Nader Hashemi come and visit UCSD a couple months ago, and he said, the only thing that can save the Iranian government in the long term is an external strike. So the Syrian government now is internally delegitimized. The number of people who turn against it within the population, passively, actively, to demonstrate whatever, is increasing and will continue to increase. However, if the kinds of things that the Syrian government has said to legitimize its repression of its own population over the last year are suddenly validated by external moves, the government will be weak, will be strengthened, internally and externally. And this is not something that people should want, if you see what I mean. So an external threat, a legitimate external threat from outside, especially from the United States or from the Gulf powers, will strengthen the Syrian government in the short term and allow it to crush the opposition more definitively, more decisively than it can do now, I think.
You know, I don't know if you or anyone knows enough to answer this question, but I remember at the beginning of the Libyan intervention, there were lots of people who said Obama should do more and take the leadership. We should do this and we should do that. You had McCain and you had Hawks and all the rest of it, and we're kicking off an election year. And I just wonder what you think about Syrian intervention by the United States in some form, through NATO, through the UN, gets into the campaign and becomes an idea difficult to stop. Have you given that any thought at all?
I haven't, and I do think you're absolutely right. I mean, the difficult to stop. It's a definitional question. Once we have a kind of something that is defined as a problem, it has to be dealt with. And so McCain has tried to do this. He's tried to make this an issue, actually. And in the same way that Prime Minister Netanyahu, AIPAC, and the Republican candidates have tried to make Iran an issue that has to be dealt with. This is a terrible development if these kinds of things manage to take on steam, to get legs, as they say among journalists, I think. Because they make action, they create an imperative for action, which is counterproductive for all involved, I think, and so hopefully that won't happen. Now, I would say that one thing that I think was instructive is that there was an Arab League plan some 4 or 5 months ago. That was created by the Arab League. Now, the Arab League doesn't do much, but it did this. It was a plan to censor Syria, or censure, I should say, Syria, and to send observers and so on. The plan was taken to the United Nations, where from there it went to the Security Council, where the Arab League plan, which was devised by Arabs, by the Arab states, became an American plan. And once it was an American plan, the Russians could convincingly and legitimately oppose it. And so it was vetoed. It was vetoed, or it was threatened to be vetoed by the Russians in the United Nations Security Council. What this means is that the United States' involvement in these kinds of events is the kiss of death. And so and maybe the people who actually advanced that plan, I don't want to be too conspiratorial here, but the people who advanced that plan, they may have known that. That if that plan succeeded, if that plan was advanced as only an Arab League plan, it would be much more difficult for other countries to oppose it. And then that would have created an imperative for some sort of action. Not military action, but some sort of action. And it's possible, not even unlikely, that the United States at that time didn't want that, and so allowed that plan to go forward with its imprint, knowing that its imprint would guarantee its failure. And so this is the sort of world we live in, where the association with the United States by the Syrian opposition, by the Arab League, can serve to create a dynamic where those movements can be opposed more convincingly by the Syrian government, and that too can lead to greater repression and more military operations by the Syrian government.
So I understand this if this would be the Bush administration, but this is 3-point-something years of the Obama administration, where Obama kicks his administration off with a great speech in Cairo, and now you're saying America's still the kiss of death over there. So is Obama a failure in terms of Middle East policy?
No, he's not a failure in terms of Middle East policy. He's given what's possible, I think he's done well. He's done well in a way that has thankfully eluded the myopic and not very well-informed punditry in the United States, particularly on the right. So in 2009, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran was campaigning for his re-election, and he was continually attempting to provoke the American government over and over again. And Obama, to his credit, said repeatedly, well, we're sure that the Iranian public has the wisdom to decide their elections wisely and sensibly, and we won't get involved. So this had the effect of undermining and delegitimizing Ahmadinejad, and forced him actually to be, he was trying to create a response that would bolster his popularity, because many people said, Iranian specialists, that George Bush was responsible, that the axis of evil was responsible for the election of Ahmadinejad and the sweeping aside of the Iranian reformers. So Obama was clever enough not to play this game, and Ahmadinejad was forced to steal his election because of it. If Obama had said, we won't take that, we're gonna destroy you, his popularity, Ahmadinejad's popularity, would have gone through the roof. It would have been unnecessary to steal the election, and he would have been reelected handily. So no one noticed this here. Not one newspaper reported this, as far as I know. But this was what was happening. And it was smart, and it was clever, and it was artful. And I, for one, was impressed. The situation in Egypt was impressive. I'm sure that phone calls took place between the State Department and the generals, and they said, you got to cut him loose. But we're not going to cut you loose as long as you cut him loose. And by the way, don't shoot people. I'm sure these conversations took place. And you don't have to have a sharp historical sensibility to know that no previous American administration would have been clever enough not to back our dictator until the streets were running with blood, which is what Mubarak would have been happy to do. And if he had thought, like the Shah did, and like dozens of others have done before. So this was something new. And he's not, the president, the government, the American government is not going to get any credit for that. But historically speaking, it's new, and it was wise, and it kept people from being killed. And the outcome was sure anyway. I mean, Mubarak was going. So the sooner and I'm sure also that people like Robert Gates and Secretary of State Clinton didn't want to cut him loose, and he overrode those people. Now I'm speculating, but I think that that's a reasonable speculation.
I saw just yesterday on the news pictures in the cities with lots of tanks. Where Syria get those tanks, and are they being resupplied, and by whom, and what does the United States think of that?
Well, the entire Syrian military comes from Russia and from the Soviet Union before that. And the Syrians still owe the Soviet Union billions, which will never be repaid, and nobody expects it to be repaid, from the resupply during the 70s, after the 73 war, from the resupply after 82, when the Syrians fought the Israelis in Lebanon. They lost 70 fighter planes in a single day fighting against the Israeli Air Force, for example. Those airplanes were replaced. So the entire armory comes from Russia. The Russians have long-term relations with Syria, and of course Putin himself is sensitive to the possibility of a popular movement against his government in Moscow, something which actually has been happening. So there's a real coalition of interests there, more so right now, in fact, than in any time in the last 20 years probably, which is a sad coincidence for the prospects of the Syrian opposition. The Russians also have a base in Syria near the eastern, or rather the western Mediterranean coast, a naval base, which they want to keep. It's the only Russian naval base in the Mediterranean. And for Russia, an alliance with Syria, a close relationship with Syria, is a matter of geopolitical credibility, of prestige, of tradition. So it's very important to Putin, and not something that will be the Russians will not be talked out of this. It's not something that they're going to give up on, because any other possibility threatens Russian interests in a way that Putin and probably no Russian leader would countenance.
Professor Provence, thank you so much for spending time with us. We really appreciate your comments.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
You have watched Understanding Syria, an interview with Michael Provence about this conflict in Syria and its historical and political context. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break. That's all the time we have today. We look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy this last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, I am Rani Al-Jundi, and look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience. The American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors. The Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride. And by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.
الساعة 7:07 دقايق أنا بعد من نومي شفايق وميت عشفت قهوي عزمتني وعملت لي ركوي أطيب منها مش دايق أنا أطيب منها لا 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 مش دايق الساعة 7:07 دقايق أنا بعد من نومي شفايق وميت عشفت قهوي عزمتني وعملت لي حالي وعم بسأل عن حالي بقلبي بعيوني يلي بتحبك يا ويلي ما أطول دربك والأصعب كله مفارق سبع دقايق أنا بعدي من نومي شفايق وميت عاشفة قهوي عزمتني وعملت لي ركوي أطيب منها مش دايق أنا أطيب منها لا 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 مش دايق خفة دمك مثل النسمة لما بشوفك بنسى اسمي أو بنسى كل اللي حوالي لما صوتك ينده لي والبوس بتجن علي وتنجل عخدودك حارق أنا بعدي من نومي شفايق وميت عاشفة قهوي عزمتني وعملتني ركوي هو أطيب منها مش دايق أنا أطيب منها لا 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 مش دايق لا 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 مش دايق لهجر قصرك وارجع بيت الشعر واعد لأهلي بعد ما دقت القمر لهجر